Well, good morning. Then we will start in English. Thank you very much for everybody for coming. So we are now in the second conference of this professorship of Mexico and China. I remind you, the last conference was on the growth miracle and the economic transition, the period 1978 to 2010. Today the topic is the end of the growth miracle, state capitalism and the new normal in China today. So today we will be able to discuss more current topics. And on Friday, the last conference is on the great gamble, global ambitions and domestic challenges, China in the 21st century. No? With a more global perspective beyond China. No? So I would ask you again for the session of today to keep in mind the topics for the third. And well, I simply welcome again Professor Barry Naughton, and again the dynamics will be similar to the first conference, a presentation of around 45 to 60 minutes, and then we will have another half an hour or 45 minutes for rounds of questions. No inauguration, so we'll have time for discussion. Thank you, Barry.
On Monday, in his comments, Carlos Heredia said democracy explains 50% of everything. So I thought that was a great summary for what we did on Monday. And today, we're going to do the other 50%. So when we're done today, we'll know 100% of everything about China. It'll be great, and we'll be all set for Friday. And in particular, what I want to do is talk about the ways in which the Chinese economic system has changed, not just since 1978, but also especially in the last 15 years. Because what I want to do to approach this question is to talk about what I'm calling the happiness paradox. I think you probably know something about this currently fashionable happiness literature. This is all derived from doing surveys of populations and asking people how happy they are. And of course, countries differ immensely, right? Some countries are really cheerful, and like the Hungarians are really gloomy, you know, no matter how things are going, they're always depressed. But time series for a given country sometimes tells us something, right? And for China, if we go back to a kind of crucial turning point, about 2002, 2003, we find something very strange about happiness. Namely, at that time, economists, including myself, were very happy, and ordinary people weren't. Now, why? It may just be because economists are idiots, that's possible. But I think there's a deeper structure to it. Here's one part of it that certainly would explain something. This is workers in state-owned enterprises. And let me try and point out some key points here without straying too far from the microphone. If you see this data here in the early 1990s, one of the things you see is Chinese employment in state-owned enterprises actually increased for about 15 years after 1978. And for a decade, right, from the early 1990s to the early 2000s, the number of workers in state-owned enterprises declined from 76 million to 43 million. In other words, more than 30 million people lost their jobs during that period. And of course, this was something extremely painful, extremely difficult, but it was also something essential for the further evolution of the Chinese economy. So as a result, when we got to, say, 2003, I say economists were happy. Why? Economists were happy because they saw a process of economic reform that was succeeding, and even to a fundamental sense, had already succeeded. We can, break that down into a few components, but the basic parts of it are pretty straightforward, right? The state sector had declined dramatically as a share of the economy. A whole set of new institutions had been created during the 1990s, including a central bank, the fiscal system that worked, a foreign trade system that worked, current account convertibility for the currency. China had then sealed this remarkable progress by entering the World Trade Organization. That happened in 2001, but with a series of commitments that phased in over about 4 years. But most important, economists, with their fundamental belief in the efficacy of markets, believed that with the success of economic reform, China's economic growth would accelerate. I remember very specifically a day in 2002 when the Development Research Center, it's one of the top think tanks in China, had received a report from one of their researchers saying that China's growth was going to slow down for structural reasons related to what we were talking about on Monday. And they decided to hold a little seminar about this possibility. What was the prospect for the Chinese economy? So they invited 3 or 4 foreign economists and 3 or 4 good Chinese domestic economists. We sat around a round table and we went around the table, and every single economist, Chinese economy is going to grow rapidly over the next decade and might even. And the reason why, well, from Monday, factor input growth was still going on, and more important, with successful economic reform, efficiency, productivity would improve, and China's economy would go. So economists are happy, right? But ordinary people, not so much. On the one hand, ordinary people are dealing with high unemployment. That is, maybe urban people had family members who were laid off for state-owned enterprises. They can also see the numbers. They saw that the unemployment rate hit about 10% in this period. So there were a whole set of new types of uncertainty, new types of risk. Corruption was getting worse. The process of downsizing the state sector, even though China never really privatized, never had the extreme injustice that occurred in the Soviet Union when firms were sold off to the oligarchs, still there was an awful lot of insider privatization that took place as well, and people were aware of it, they didn't like it. Inequality was getting worse. The whole fundamental basis of society was changing, and maybe even more important, why would ordinary people believe the economists who told them that things were going to get better? Right? And they didn't. And so when you got questionnaires that asked people how happy they were, at this time period, they typically responded that they weren't especially happy. The people who studied happiness said, well, this is a paradox. Look at China, it's an outlier. Income has increased rapidly, and we see in other countries, rapidly increasing income is associated with a happier outlook and a higher response to the happiness questions. They said, well, there's a China paradox. But of course, from our perspective, it's not a paradox at all. Reported being unhappy because they were subject to much more uncertainty, doubt, risk, unfairness, and all those other things which we know make people. Now, why does that matter? Whether or not Chinese people were happy 15 years ago, who cares, right? It matters, though, very much from a kind of historical standpoint. Because from a deeper, systemic, structural standpoint, this was the best possible time for China to push forward with another set of reforms, and who knows, maybe even push reforms from economics into the legal system, into the constitutional system. In terms of the feeling on the street, what people wanted, it wasn't a good time at all. People were unhappy, and they wanted, if anything, the pendulum to swing. They wanted the government to start working on a rebuilding of social welfare networks, rebuilding of healthcare systems, trying to protect people who had fallen through the gaps during the previous. So the reason I want to bring us back to this period is that it was at this time, 2002, 2003, a new administration came in, an administration that on the surface seemed committed to market-oriented reform. But in fact, as they began to make policy, we found that the powerful impetus between market-oriented reform in China disappeared. Of course, people still wanted to reform the economy. They still wanted a more efficient economy. But specific institutional reforms became just one among a packet of objectives that policymakers sought to achieve. So what I want to do today is talk about this new normal that evolved out of that fundamental turning point. Once it became the case that economic reform was no longer the predominant objective of policymakers, and China entered into a new normal, in a way parallel to the new normal we were talking about on Monday, right? On Monday was slower growth as we get out of the vertical growth era. But today it's a different kind of new normal. It's a new normal in the sense that policymakers have a bundle of different objectives that they trade off, where different interest groups push for or obstruct different types of policy, and where reforms are something that people always talk about, as we know from our own countries, but that don't always happen, right? Now, that's not enough, of course, because China's system was unique, individual, and weird, right? China's system at this point, in the early 2000s, was definitely market-based, but definitely only partially reformed. There was still a lot to be done. So at that time, as we looked at the pendulum swing away from dramatic, radical economic reform towards other kinds of social policies, everybody thought, well, this is normal for a pause. There are other things that need to be done, and in particular, further market-oriented reforms will be much more successful if there is a reconstituted social safety network. And yet, this swing turned out to be not just a temporary pause, but in fact, something more fundamental. What I want to do today is take first a quick glance backwards, just look at reforms an earlier period up through about 2002, 2003, and then use three dimensions to try and categorize what China's economic system looks like today, and in particular, what the context is in which Xi Jinping pushes a set of new objectives, which we all see in front of us, sort of in the news every day, and especially since the 19th Party Congress. So of course, just quickly, as everybody knows, China carried out a set of gradualist reforms, exploratory reforms. The Chinese leader Chen Yun developed this wonderful term to describe it, crossing the river by groping for stepping stones. This policy, actually one of the strange things about it when you look back, is that you see that gradualist policies in the 1980s very different from the gradualist policies that were followed in the 1990s. You can think of it in this way. In the 1980s, policymakers were sort of looking for ways to break apart the monopoly that the old command system had on the economy, opening up cracks that would allow new kinds of market activity, giving incentives to people, allowing them to do that, and allowing the economy to grow in areas where the plan wasn't important or significant. Then, after a clear turning point in the early 1990s, the policy shifted and they said, well, that's worked, we've done it. Now we need to create more of a level playing field. Let's create institutions, create financial institutions, and subject firms like state-owned enterprises to fair competition, meaning that some of them will get forced out of business and declare bankruptcy. So you have this very strong pattern where different leaders produce different policy bundles. 1980s leader, of course, Deng Xiaoping at top, but especially Zhao Ziyan as premier, driving the actual introduction of specific policies and really making things work. And Zhao Ziyan's vision develops too far, becomes too radical. Deng Xiaoping and the other elders decide, no, can't go with him. We're not willing to go with Zhao Ziyan when he says to the demonstrators at Tiananmen Square, we're with you. And so he's deposed and suppressed. But in the next decade, we get another strong economic leader, Zhu Rongji, who pushes forward in a different direction, and they're very complementary. So when in the next decade, Jintao and Wen Jiabao come to power, of course we expect that they'll be different. We didn't necessarily expect that this difference would mean a reduction in commitment to market-oriented reform. Now, how do we explain all these different reactions? Why is Zhao Ziyan one way, Zhu Rongji another way, and Hu and Wen still another? One of the keys to understanding this is just to look at the government budget in aggregate terms. I'm going to do this right now looking backward from 2002, but then later I'm going to resume this and bring it all the way up to the present. And here you see something I hope you find to be quite remarkable. 1978 until 1993, China's budget collapsed. 1978, China had 33% of GDP go into the hands of the government, directly government fiscal revenues. And by 1993, that had declined to 11%. In other words, China was facing a crisis of government capability. It was becoming unclear if it could just do the most basic things that policymakers wanted to achieve. Now, why was that happening? Well, actually, if you think about it, it's pretty straightforward. The old command economy system was based on the idea you'd have all these state enterprises with monopoly powers. Open that system up and allow private competition, what's going to happen to all those monopoly profits? They disappear. And there it is. You see it happen. So as of the early 1990s, policymakers faced a whole new set of challenges. It was a crisis. They had to act. And they did. They acted by developing a new tax system. They acted by developing a whole range of new institutions, as I mentioned before. Instead of the old system of opening up cracks, this was a system of institutional creation. And it worked. Let's look at this graph. Wow. Helps us out. Look at that turnaround. Holy smokes, right? From this dramatic decline, arrested, and then rebounds very dramatically. And so by today, straight budgetary revenues, and we'll talk about this definition a little bit later, are over 20% of GDP. It will be interesting to see how they turn out in 2017. We'll get the data. Increased every single year as a share of GDP. Remember, GDP is growing really rapidly, right? This is a miracle economy. GDP is growing rapidly, and yet budgetary revenues are growing more rapidly than GDP, increasing their share every single year between 90. So in other words, China reforms as a way out of a crisis. And it works, right? When China sees the challenge facing it, adopts tough, dramatic, difficult reforms, succeeds. Here's just a quick additional graph as a throwaway, one of the things that happens when you establish budgetary stability is it's much easier to establish macroeconomic stability as well. In the earlier periods, inflation is high and fluctuating, but after the mid-90s, budget recovers, central bank is in place, the inflationary picture changes qualitatively in China. So just to conclude this sort of first phase of laying the groundwork, right? We get to a situation in the early 2000s where China no longer needs to give overwhelming priority to market-oriented economics. I mean, after all, you can't blame people, right? People have been through a lot. They want to step back maybe from the pace. There's no fundamental crisis that confronts the Chinese economy after about 2003 until the global financial crisis comes from outside. Moreover, the economist's prediction starts to come true, right? The economy accelerates from 2003. So if China doesn't do a whole lot in the way of market-oriented economic reform in the middle of the first decade in the 21st century, well, who can blame them? Because there's not really any reason why they have to. Reforms are difficult, things like urgency fades. Now, before we get to the next section where I trace these three different aspects of the economy, let's just establish a quick baseline or two. First of all, because I'm going to make some criticisms later on, let me make absolutely clear. In fundamental sense, by this time, China has become predominantly a market economy. After the downsizing of the state sector at the turn of the century, private industry predominates. Private businesses predominate in most sectors. Even some of the really key high-tech sectors that are very strategic and very important are, as you probably know, dominated by companies that are at least nominally private, right? Alibaba, of course, Tencent, and Baidu. So private business plays a fundamental role in the economy. It's the basis of the economy. And you would even argue that in certain sectors, their system is more competitive than ours. Because in certain sectors, you see this intense competition between foreign invested firms, state firms, local companies, very small scale, knockoff firms. You think of cell phones, for instance, where the Chinese market has competition between all these different business models. As a result, you can get a cell phone for the equivalent of $20, or you can buy an iPhone 10 for the equivalent of $1,000. You have everything of it. And yet, if we only look at that manufacturing sector, we miss something about the Chinese economy. For one thing, I'm going to show you two slides here that give you tables of percentages, right? And they both have about the same message. That is, first, if you look at the first line, mining and manufacturing, and then the right-hand column is the percentage of the labor force that's in government-owned entities. So if you look at industry, government ownership less than 10%. It's almost trivial. Only a few sectors really differ from that. And of course, there are a whole range of services in which that's true as well. Look at some of the more capital-intensive, but even more so, human capital-intensive services, by which we mean education, government, research, but also finance and business services. And the government share 62%. In other words, all of those urban, high-skilled sectors are still predominantly in This is the same thing if we look, another good indicator would be investment, share of state investment, total investment. Same outcome, except that we see there are a range of infrastructure sectors that are very capital intensive, support a lot of investment. Government is, of course, dominant. So, if we're just trying to characterize the Chinese economy in the broad brush terms, we'd say this is a market economy based on private ownership, except that government control of many key high-skilled sectors, especially high-skilled service sectors, is still very, very important. So it's a little bit of a paradox, and we need to keep that in mind as we start looking at these other dimensions. All right, as I said, I'm going to look at three dimensions. The first follows directly from what we just talked about. That is the size of the state. How big is the Chinese state? I'm going to argue is it's very, very big. Even taking in mind what I just said about the structure of ownership, we still are going to find that the Chinese state, in terms of resources through the taxation and similar processes, is very large. Second, the fiscal system is still the one that we had 20 years ago. So it has certain properties which are kind of difficult to grapple with. And third, state enterprises, even though they play a much reduced role, still under Xi Jinping in certain ways have been playing a more important role. So I think if we look at these three dimensions in combination with what we've already seen, get a very, very good sense of the sort of urging China model. Is it different? What is it? What do we call it? You know, I've experimented with calling it state capitalism, but I'm not really happy with that. Wrote an article asking, is China socialist? And I think the answer to that question ended up being, maybe. It ended up being that 20 years ago, China definitely wasn't socialist, but today, you could have different views. And I think what I'd like to do today is look at these three dimensions as a way not to try and answer that question, what's the best label to put on China, but just to give a sense of the complexity, the value of what's been achieved, but also the limitations in the system that seems to be coming together. All right, so let's go ahead and do it. First of all, size of the state. So after this turning point that I've started with, when the Hu Jintao-Wen Jiabao administration came in, they did less in terms of economic reform, but they did quite a bit in terms of rebuilding a social network that the government provided. I'm not really going to talk much about this because there, some very good articles have been written about this by various people. But let me just tick off some of the things that they achieved. First of all, it's not even on the list here, but one of the first things that Wen Jiabao did was reduce taxes on farmers. Of course, in China, farmers are much poorer than urban residents. And so, as budgetary revenues were increasing, he said, no, to impose direct taxes on farmers anymore. In fact, we can subsidize to a significant extent, and they started subsidizing farmers pretty much up to the limit, and maybe even beyond the limit of what was permitted in their WTO accession. That was certainly good for the social fairness in China. Basic health insurance system was created. Very rudimentary in some ways, doesn't pay much, but enough to make a big difference for especially a rural person who has an illness, catastrophic illness, or injury. Pensions, public housing, all these things began to be part of the repertory of the Chinese government. But this was in the context of this dramatic increase in overall budgetary. Here what I've done on this right-hand side graph, what I've done is I've taken the basic information that was in the earlier graph that showed the collapse of budgetary revenues and the recovery. That's basically reflected in the solid blue part of the graph on the right. So that shows, as you can see, budgetary revenues increasing from 11% to just over 20%. I've made some adjustments to avoid double counting, but that's the standard. This is what the Chinese publish as their data about the government budget. So big increase, more than doubles as a share of GDP. Another interesting thing is to look at the other components, primary income streams that are basically under the control of the government. Start out with contributions to social insurance funds. So these new funds these new programs that were created mostly, not entirely, but mostly in the Hu Jintao Wenjiabao era, provided new services, and they always involved some kind of contribution from participants. They were subsidized too, but there was some kind of direct participation. And in the case of pensions in particular, the contributions are low. For whatever reason, the Chinese have never included these pension contributions as part of their budgetary data. But you can imagine if your demographics are actually going to explain part of this, right? Because Chinese policymakers are aware that China's on the edge of an aging society. Of course, when they set up the contribution levels and the rules for the pension system, they set them up with quite high pension contribution levels because they knew they have to accumulate some funds to be prepared for the massive wave of retirements that's going to start coming in another 10 years or so. So the second component there is contributions to social welfare funds, which have grown to be a very substantial component, about 7%. Big for a relatively low-income country. Another component, land revenues. We'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, but in the Chinese system, as you may know, land is publicly owned. City governments derive a big chunk of their revenue from the conversion of rural land into city land that can then be auctioned to developers and help fund city services. So that component has gone from 1 or 2% of GDP to 7% of GDP. And I've added one more component that admittedly is arguable, and that's the profits of state-owned enterprises, including state-owned banks. So, well, that's not exactly a government revenue, to be sure, but I think it's worth including for two reasons. One is that the sort of stand-in for the control over the economy exercise by guiding the behavior and the performance. Actually, let's just leave it at that. So that means when you put all these things together, that China has about 40% of GDP accruing in the form of budgetary revenues, or what we might call sort of quasi-fiscal revenues. 40% of GDP. Well, how much is that, 40% of GDP? It's a lot in comparative terms. Left, I don't know, can you see these country names at all? They're way too small, I think, and I apologize. I can tell you who's at the top here, which means the countries that have the smallest share of government revenues as a share of GDP. Our two countries are, of course, the champions. Mexico first, US third. The two of the three countries with the smallest share of total government revenues as a share of GDP. We're about 20%. Mexico exactly 20%, 19%. 24.4%. Wait a minute, China is close to 40%. That's about the same as Norway, Germany, It's more than the UK and France. There's a very strong pattern in comparative terms. Richer countries have bigger proportional governments. That's like a law. Yet China stands out as a country that's middle income, not even upper middle income, as a government that controls this extraordinarily large proportion of GDP. So in a way, we would have to say that China is different, right? It's different when you put together these two components. Direct government ownership of human capital intensive sector, plus the very large share of resources controlled by the government in a fiscal type. And recall, those two things don't have to have any relationship to each other, right? They're qualitatively completely different. And some of this steady growth of the size of the government in China can be explained by increasing social revenue, but not much. So here we look, this is just, again, percent of GDP, so everything is in the same basis. We see education going from 2.5% of GDP to just under 4% in 2010. We see health expenditures doubling and then tripling as a share of GDP, but they're still quite low. Public housing, which used to be nothing, increasing to almost 1% of GDP. When you put all those things together, you're still only talking about an increase in social welfare expenditures as a share of GDP of about 3%, or at max 4%. Contrast that with this graph, where in the period from 2006 to 2016, increased by well over 10 percentage points. In other words, the total mass of resources controlled by the Chinese government has increased dramatically over the last decade and a half, increased much faster in aggregate terms than the outlays for social welfare expenditures. So the Chinese government simply has more money. In fact, Chinese total budgetary revenues are greater than the non-Social Security revenues of the United States. It's that big, the economy is that big, and the share of the economy the government take is so much greater. And here, by the way, is something that I wanted to show you on Monday, but I couldn't find it, so I'm showing it now. It just shows the same investment data for China, but this time in comparison with two big groups of countries. The lowest line is the high-income countries, so including the US. So while China invests 45% of GDP, the US and similar high-income countries invest 20%. Other middle-income countries are in between. Of course, the US is actually below the high-income average. So these two things go together, right? Government with control over a very large mass of resources, plus this strong developmentalist orientation that keeps the investment share. So this first point then, where do we come away from it? Come away from it, I don't think it's really a surprise to very many people, but I think what should be a surprise is this. China's government is very big and powerful, but that reality is a relatively recent development. Only 20 years ago, not only was the Chinese economy much, much smaller, but government control of resources within that economy was a very small proportion. Today, arguably a third. So we could think of the Chinese government as tripling its take in terms of, at the same time that the economy has quadrupled in size. In other words, the Chinese government has more than 10 times as much resources under its direct control today. All right, let's go to the second one, the fiscal system. The fiscal system in China is really odd. It is, in theory, highly centralized. In practice, highly decentralized. And this produces some very strange outcomes because local government officials in China have lots of discretion. But in order to fulfill this discretion, they have to do two things. Number one, they have to develop their own resources, typically by developing land. So land as a part of local government performance is huge. No local official can dispense with the need. Businessmen in terms of land. The other key feature is local officials are responsive to higher levels rather than being responsive to their local constituents. They have to fulfill the priorities and targets sent from the upper level because no local official is directly accountable to his population, but he is accountable to whatever the central government sets as the key political priorities. Talked about this a little bit in question and answer on Monday and pointed out that, one of the aspects of the high growth period in China, and thus one of the aspects of most of this time period up until very, very recently, is that local government officials were strongly motivated to grow the economy beyond anything else. GDP growth and fiscal revenue growth motivated local officials active and energetic. This creates a lot of problems, right? It creates a lot of problems. Let me skip ahead to a slide and let me skip this one. I've got way too many slides. Fiscal system, so I'm going to skip. Forgive me for jumping a little bit. Let me just first show a couple of slides that outlay the system. This is who spends the money. And the lower black bar is the national government. Much, much bigger red bar are local. See, almost all of the expenditures are carried out by local governments. How can that be? Well, the tax system has the central government collect taxes in the first instance and then redistribute a very huge chunk of resources. Local governments are dependent on the central government for resources to a huge extent, except for the money they can raise through land development. Which creates a bunch of problems. Who should be responsible for what? For education. Who's responsible for Social Security? A whole set of problems that have been on the table. Here's land revenues. This is essentially the same. This is one component of the land revenues are big, as I say, 6, 7. So in order to change this situation, China put forward a dramatic set of fiscal reforms, 2013 and 2014. And if you think about it, you can kind of imagine what these reforms. Spoke a little bit, again, in Q&A on Monday, about the fact that Chinese tax system is not redistributive. It does not transfer resources from wealthy to poor people. And yet, we saw from the previous graph that the overall Chinese tax take is big. What that means is that China has a tax system that has a big impact on the economy, but isn't very efficient. So in 2013-2014, the Minister of Finance, who was a long-time economic reformer, big part of the key group of economists who've been pushing economic reforms for 20, 30 years, put forward a 3-step program of fiscal reform. And that program said, first of all, fix local government debt. Because as part of this system, local governments dependent upon the center, but also needing to make deals to develop land. During the global financial crisis, they had taken on an enormous amount in order to give them the leverage they needed to carry through the kind of development projects on which their success was fundamentally based. OTUA said, let's do that first. And second, we need new direct taxes. Or direct taxes, right? Direct taxes are taxes not on transactions, which was what but on factors of production, on workers, on individuals, and on land, on capital, on property. So this means in particular a greatly expanded income tax and property taxes. That'll be the second year. And in the third year, when we see what these new taxes are, then we can finally come to a kind of renewed assignment of responsibility to government at different levels, between the central government and the local. In other words, the Chinese government in 2014 said, we're going to completely restructure our fiscal system in order to make it more market-oriented and more effective in terms of getting out of specific transactions. It didn't happen. Here, 4 years later, more than 4 years later in some cases, the whole fiscal reform program has. One of the things to watch in China is to watch whether fiscal reforms get restarted now that Xi Jinping has achieved a second term and seems to have an even stronger grip on power than he. What we saw over the last 3 to 4 years was the first steps were taken. Took these local government debts, they restructured them, they tried to make new rules that said local government officials can't do certain things. But in the end, the debt that was restructured was given to, guess who? The state banks that had made the loans in the first place. Now the local government debt sits on the state bank balance sheets as a form of local government bonds or municipal bonds instead of bank lending. It's cheaper, it's less of a burden in terms of threat to macroeconomic stability, but it's not fundamentally any different in terms of fiscal position. Again, I'm going to skip, I think this gets a little too detailed. I'm going to skip some of it. The key point is the national government did succeed in capping the traditional debt, but guess what? As soon as they did that, they started to introduce whole new institutions to funnel money to local governments again. Spend any time talking to local officials in China, it takes about 10 minutes before they start talking about public-private partnerships, right? They feel that public-private partnerships may be the way to get local governments back in the game in terms of investment and development. Also, I'll talk next time and to a certain extent today about new investment funds, new guidance funds that are set up, but to a certain extent controlled by local governments, to invest in some of the new priorities and projects of the current wave of policy. So strangely, the effort to impose fiscal discipline on local governments. Why? To be honest, we don't know. We can look at least two different hypotheses. One hypothesis would be a pure interest group hypothesis, that the Xi Jinping administration came in, tried to squeeze out the excess lending and cut back some of the debt that local governments had accumulated, but found that local governments were in fact simply too powerful within the political system and were able to effectively fend off these efforts to control their financial room for maneuver. And we would see that therefore both in the failure of the debt restructuring and in the ability of the local governments to develop these new institutions, public-private partnerships, a whole bunch of other schemes that will enable them to channel money through the local governments and keep business as usual. One explanation. The other explanation, of course, would be the sheer difficulty of restructuring a tax system of this size and complexity. It's one thing to say we want to increase the income tax and implement a property tax. Chinese policymakers recognize this would be the one thing they could do that might induce a revolution in China. If people who are already paying, after all, quite a high tax burden, shows up in terms of indirect taxes, there's a pretty serious sequencing issue here, right? If you have already a high tax burden, and in addition, people say, now we're going to introduce new income tax and property taxes, needless to say, if people were unhappy in 2003, they're going to be extremely unhappy to face a new set of taxes like that. So clearly, restructuring the fiscal system would mean lowering taxes in many areas, increasing direct taxes. That means you face an incredibly complicated political bargain. If you believe more in the second explanation rather than the first, then you might be more optimistic that a newly empowered Xi Jinping might decide to push through some of these changes. But so far, we can't. All right. So, conclusion on fiscal reforms, clear failure. A way that stands as an obstacle to the Chinese, creating not necessarily a more free market system, but at least a market system that works more efficiently and with less local government intervention. Also, that would be very important for corruption. All right, one more area, the third of our areas, and that is state. And we already saw that state enterprises as a share of the total economy, much less important than they used to be. But in the last few years, we've seen a new desire to give state enterprises an important role. We might say that Chinese government policy has shifted in this way. In the old days, they believed in state-owned enterprises as some kind of manifestation of the old socialist development project. Today, China looks for national champions wherever it can find them, and maybe has a slight preference for state-owned enterprises as national champions rather than private enterprises, but actually doesn't care that much. In other words, the Chinese government would like to foster the development of national champions, whether they're state enterprises or private firms. Alibaba is a national champion just as much as China Mobile is a national champion. And companies like Huawei and ZTE, Huawei is nominally private, actually it's employee-owned. ZTE is nominally state, although it has external ownership participation. But all of these companies are national champions that the Chinese government supports and would like to see. So if we look at reform of the state enterprise system in the last, especially just the last, a lot of people think, oh, nothing is happening. That's wrong. It's not true that nothing is happening. State-owned enterprises in the last year have been subject to dramatic corporate governance reforms that finally, after almost 20 years, complete the process of converting state forms into. They've welcomed in outside investors in a program called mixed ownership. And the Social Security Fund, so again, demographics play a role, the Social Security Fund is taking 10% ownership stake. These are all important progressive reforms that could make the state ownership sector more productive. But guess what's happening at the same time? Much more control. And in particular, control exercised through the Communist Party. Xi Jinping has said the distinctive Chinese feature in terms of the corporate governance system is that the Communist Party is embedded in corporate. What does that mean? First of all, it means when a state-owned enterprise, or even an enterprise where the state has a voice, sets up a board of directors. Of course, the board of directors reflects ownership stakes, except that under normal circumstances, the chairman of the board of directors should be the secretary of the Communist Party of that enterprise. So boards of directors are also a kind of an element of Communist Party control. And as if that's not enough, there's a new ruling that's being incorporated into the rules of most charters, rather the enterprise charters, that says, and this is almost a direct quote here, right? Major strategic firm decisions must be discussed first by the party committee, and only then by the board of directors, and only then adopted by the CEO. That's a really crucial element of what's happening in China today. One of the strange things about this is that it reverses one of the crucial determinations made in China, get this, back in the mid-1980s. For 30 years, from the 1980s to 2015 or so, China operated under a system called factory manager responsibility, which said, yes, the Communist Party is the dominant political force. In an enterprise, this old doctrine said, the CEO is the boss, and the party secretary plays a secondary role with importance. That policy has now been reversed. So for the first time in 30 years, the Communist Party committee head is... Now this may seem a little, I know you can look at this and you can say, well, wait a minute, isn't this all the same guy wearing different hats? I mean, are we talking about the guy who's the chairman of the board of directors, sitting in on the board of directors, but then he's sitting in at the party committee meeting first, and in some cases he might even be the CEO? True. But remember, this is in the context of a political system, a standard way of managing large organizational choices. The Communist Party to meet first, make important decisions, and then subtly and usually quite effectively make sure that the institutions of government follow through on the choices. For instance, right now, we're all waiting to see what the Chinese government will look like in March in next year. But the people in the top levels of the Communist Party already know, because they have key choices which will then be implemented when the National People's Congress meets. So, are these state enterprises reforming? You can't really answer that question, because in some sense they are receiving a better, more explicit corporate governance system with a more diverse ownership structure. But in some ways not, because Communist Party control is strengthened, and that's going to make corporate governance less. Let's take it a step further and see if we can resolve this issue. Yes, market-oriented reforms are taking place in the sense that state enterprises are working more and more through financial mechanisms and financial relationships rather than direct command and control relationships. You're going to see more about this on Friday, because these guidance funds have a big impact for industrial policy, which will be our topic on Friday. But guidance funds are a way for the government at the central and local level to exercise their ownership in a financial way. Now, you might think, if we're exercising ownership in a financial way, we're maximizing return, like a sovereign wealth fund, like Temasek in Singapore, like the Norwegian oil fund, right? These are all government-controlled funds that seek to maximize return. In some ways in China, there's a movement in that direction, but on the other hand, these funds almost all have some kind of developmental objective. They're not being instructed to maximize returns. They're instructed to maximize the development of China's high-tech economy. Or in a few cases, do things like help struggle against poverty. They have different objectives. They all have objectives. So again, we see this kind of paradox where the instruments are becoming more efficient, but at the same time they're becoming more targeted, more controlled, and with more oriented towards the strategic objective. It's a big change. And again, what exactly is going on? Well, it's hard to make a final judgment since we can't see into the Chinese system. One way, these policies undoubtedly make the state sector more efficient because they concentrate government intervention and control in the areas where policymakers actually want to see change. They don't bother to use public ownership as an instrument to just maintain the normal operations of the economy, which was the great irrationality of the old Soviet-style system, right? It just spent worthless stuff. Second, maybe it's interest groups again. State managers, the state entities that run firms, all these people have more resources and, more importantly, more prestige and more autonomy. And finally, they think that it's going to give them more effective ways to steer the economy. So, boy, that was a lot of contradictory stuff, right? I mean, what it tells us is that the Chinese economy and the Chinese economic system is changing in fundamental ways. It no longer makes sense to think of China as in transition from a command economy to a market. It's something else. And the contours of the Chinese system aren't quite clear yet. They involve elements of contradiction, elements of uncertainty. But at a minimum, it looks increasingly like a system in which government plays a role that we are not accustomed to seeing in size and importance. It's a market-based system, to be sure, and in a sense a private ownership-based system, but at the same time, it's a system where the government, and especially the party, is exercising much more effort to control the direction of that economy. They have more effective tools to do so. State ownership, yeah, it's one of those. But the difference between state ownership and private ownership is becoming less important. As long as companies are national champions. These changes in the final dwarf the movement towards being more of a social welfare. Is China evolving towards a social welfare state? I personally would say as an essential component of being socialist. To me, the answer is, well, to some extent, in the sense that the pendulum has swung away from the extreme inequality of the 1990s towards a system where government at least takes some responsibility for different social outcomes. But more fundamentally, no. Because the movement towards the strengthening of a government dwarfs the movement. So what we're seeing in China today is something that I don't think we have any direct parallels for in other countries in the past. It's kind of a national, directed developmental state that's putting far more emphasis on high-tech and integrated national development I've ever seen before. Economy where the system is trying to incorporate all of the different economic and social into a new developmental surge because they believe that's the only way to avoid the middle income trap, reestablish the security of the political system, and push China into, as they say it, the center of the international stage within it. So it's quite a new phenomenon. We've got to watch it every day and with me in watching it as it evolves over the next years. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Barry, for this very interesting presentation. I will start with some comments simply to introduce and to allow for a transition with your questions. No? I simply remind you that if you get into the webpage of Cechimex, you will find a group of readings for each of the sessions. And there is also the PowerPoint presentation of Barry of last Monday, and today in the afternoon we will have also the PPT of today. No? Look, some comments from my part. Again, I think it is extremely useful for us that you share with us these general and more detailed reflections on your perspective, your opinion, your analysis on China. No? It allows us to have some kind of structure for analyzing China, this very complex continent, no? With a long history, with so many different features, where the easiest and most complex analysis usually simply states the Chinese characteristics, no? which says little or maybe a lot. No? But in many times in China, they love to say that, well, China has Chinese characteristics, and so well, what does this mean? No? So again, it is very useful in terms of these main topics that you highlight. I thought it was interesting, this discussion of the happiness paradox, some of the tensions in this happy period, no? of the large growth period, some of the characteristics of this new normal since the 2000s, no? Which again, it is very interesting there that yes, this new normal for this giant of an economy is still growing at an impressive rate. No? Again, their Chinese authorities are in many cases very humble, probably. Yes, China will not grow with 2 digits, but the capacity of growing at between 6 and 7%, as it has been doing in the last years, it's very, very impressive. No? Far beyond any comparative economy, not to speak of Japan, the US, the European Union, and many others. No? The proposal of the analysis of these 3 dimensions of China, the size of the market, the fiscal system, and state enterprises, I can only invite you to look. Barry mentioned this document of Is China Socialist? You can download from the webpage of Cechimex. Some of these topics are in this document and some of the other documents. This is extremely helpful for us. No? Again, we're trying, I would tell you, here at UNAM and other places, trying to understand China in many cases from a Latin American and from a Mexican perspective, and your analysis, your sources, your statistics are very useful. No? Finally, I agree, or I find the analysis interesting regarding the analysis of the political economy of China today in 2018, and of course, this impressive capacity of China, this huge economy, this huge continent, and its capacity of continuing with reforms, with ongoing reforms. No? From a Latin American perspective, and in Mexico also, well, we start with reforms, and after a couple of reforms, you say, okay, let's rest a bit, and then in 10 or 15 years we start with new reforms. No? What is impressive in China is that there is no rest. No? And probably this also has to do probably with the power structure within China and the need also of the Chinese Communist Party to be in constant change, in constant move, and it reminds me a little bit of some of the old sayings of Chairman Mao and many others, the need of continuous reforms. No? Again, as a foreigner, it is simply impressive, this constant movement and constant reforms. No? I would, and again, I find some of the conclusions very interesting, very important. No? The last sentence of your last PowerPoint, an apparent movement of China being more nationalistic probably and socialist. No? This is very important in terms of the relationship with the United States, in terms of with Mexico and many others. No? And this is what we have witnessed also in sectoral studies, etc. No? So this discussion of this national development state is very interesting. I would simply finish maybe with 4 discussion issues based on your presentation, on this paper also that you, China Socialist. No? The first issue is a little bit more conceptual, but very relevant to the first half an hour of your presentation. And regarding, is it important in your opinion to have a clear definition of state-owned enterprises, of the state, of the public sector, where in many cases, I'm not saying that you do this, but I'm saying in a lot of OECD publications and in much of the analysis of China, there are huge confusions. No? Worst case scenario is the state-owned enterprise owned by the central government could be less than 200 firms. No? So this is one extreme, if you want to, of state-owned enterprise. We have been working with some other statistics, and in some cases we end up, if you have a very bigger understanding of the public sector, you can end up saying that the public sector in China has the property of around 50% of GDP in the 2010s, 4 or 5 years ago. The property, not only control, but the property of 50% of GDP. No? So that's from one extreme, less than 200 firms, state-owned enterprises, to a measure that gets probably beyond your measures. I am saying this because from this perspective, personally, and some of the work we have been doing at SIGLO, we have been discussing this topic of the omnipresence of the public sector, trying to understand the public sector as a sum of the central government, provinces, municipalities, and cities, not only the central government, because as you correctly pose, The central government in some periods has been diminishing, but the rest can increase. So not because of the central government, its role or function decreases, the public sector has to decrease. Again, it would be interesting to have a discussion, or I would like to know your opinion regarding this. Is it useful to discuss an omnipresence of the public sector? From a Latin American and Mexican perspective, it is simply outstanding how important institutionally, but also financially, and in terms of policy makings, etc. It's amazing how important the public sector is in China. And if you do not understand this, you simply have difficulty simply to get into business or politics or academics or what education or whatever in China. One topic. The second topic is the question probably also related to the first. Is China effectively shifting to a market economy? No. I would highlight simply some of the work that has been presented by Dita Ernst, for example, work that we have been doing in particular commodity chains, auto parts, automobiles, textiles, electronics, etc. In all of these commodity chains, again, the omnipresence of the public sector is absolutely impressive. No? Dita Ernst was 2 years ago here at this professorship. He submitted a book, 3 days, discussing 3 conferences, discussing the case of semiconductors in China. Of course, you can always say, well, but this is one example, you have another 99 examples. But the case of the semiconductor industry in China is impressive in terms of policy making. 10 years ago, have results in 2020 regarding China becoming a major producer of semiconductors, no? Investing $150 billion US in almost 15 to 20 years, and investments in 2 firms. One is Huawei, and the other is Tsinghua University. And these 2 firms will compete with each other, and in 2020, according to this policy, that you could call industrial policy, R&D policies, innovation policies, however you want to call them, these 2 firms will compete with each other. Again, this model seems to go far beyond or is far away from what you would understand in a market economy. No? Third topic, from your perspective and based on your analysis, is this very relevant presence of the public sector, omnipresent or not, is not a main question, but is this very relevant presence of the public sector in China a source of China's growth in the last 40 years? Or is it the source of inefficiencies and of future crises? We have been talking of Anne Stevenson Young. She has been here also at our center. She has a very clear, strong book saying this is the source of yesterday's China's crisis. In my opinion, you cannot understand China today, not to speak in the last 40 years, without this public sector. No? And China wouldn't have neither Huawei, nor China Railway Corporation, nor many other of these champions without the public sector. But again, it's part of a discussion. No? Or what would be your opinion on this topic? And the final topic, no? Some students at the School of Economics here have been working on the financing, and particularly in the banking sector in China. So if in some sectors The omnipresence of the public sector is very high. It is I don't know if the highest, but around beyond 90% of the assets in the banking sector are of the public sector, again understood as central government, cities, municipalities, and provinces. No? And probably one of the most interesting characteristics of China's growth in the last 40 years is, of course, massive financing from the public sector to the rest of the economy, private sector, public sector, etc. No? How do you see important reforms in the last years regarding this banking sector? Is it desirable to reform this sector? Can we imagine a future growth model of China without this massive financing by the public sector? So can you privatize? Is it imaginable that, similar to other sectors, that the privatization will at one point initiate in the banking sector, etc.? So again, simply a group of questions. So we will open up to questions from you. We will get a group of questions, and then Professor Naughton will respond. Wants to speak, to say something, please present yourself. Yes, one minute.
Jorge Eduardo Navarrete. Buen día a todos. Good morning, Professor. Well, I enjoy very much this second conference by you. On the title, The New Normal on China Today, I thought first on the normal use of the expression new normal, that normally is referred to the world economy as a whole, and is telling us that we need to get used to an economy that grows far less than before the Great Recession at the beginning of the century, and that will keep this slow pace, slow rhythm of growth for the foreseeable future because of limitation of resources, because of aging of population and many other factors of moderation. But certainly you here speak to us of a new normal for China itself. But I wonder if that, in your view, also includes a period of less rapid growth. I suppose that is the situation. But how do you see the difficult, complex relation between lesser growth, which in China could mean something around 6%, with the increasing social demands of the Chinese population, very much that will be greater in the future, in my view. The need, the movement to the internal market and to satisfy internal demand, mainly of high technology consumer goods, in my view, will continue increasing. I think you mentioned, and it was a very, very justified mention, the importance of Xu Rongji as one of the architects of the present China. That was my time in Beijing, the period of Xu Rongji, and he was really a very impressive leader and a very impressive person. In another moment, you said that the response of China to the financial crisis, to the Great Recession, was decisive and successful. And I fully agree with that. Probably of the big economists was the one that better responds to the crisis. And now we are seeing the response. Was the less affected in terms of reducing growth, in terms of reducing unemployment and, of course, levels of standards of living for the population. But I would like to link this assertion with the analysis you did immediately after about those aspects of the economic policy that seems to move towards a bigger role for the market, and those others that point in the other direction and then point to a continued and probably in some cases bigger dependence or bigger relation with the non-market aspects of the economic policy. We normally used to hear about the socialism with Chinese characteristics. And in the recent Congress of the party, we hear the addition for the new era. So they are not reforming that statement, but they are insisting in that with the complement of the projection to the future. They are working now in a socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era, as in the expression of President Xi. And I wonder if these non-market elements can somehow be identified with the Chinese characteristics. What China is injecting in the model are precisely these very important, quotation marks, non-market elements of the economic approach of the country. And, well, I stop here because I am not a person called to comment, just to ask questions.
Thank you. Someone else?
Thank you, Professor Naughton, for your insightful presentation. I like it very much. My question is more of a conceptual, ontological type. Are we looking into the awakening of a whole new type paradigm of capitalism here, considering all the interesting questions that you put forth? Is it correct to still measure the relative success of the Chinese process, whether we call it socialist or state capitalism, from the standard yardstick of market economics? In your very good article, you mentioned as an example of the results of successful stories of national champions of state-owned enterprises, the case of the build-up of the largest railroad, high-speed railroad network, which was not actually the result of direct government planning. This is really a remarkable outcome that does not necessarily come from the efforts of a transition into a market economics. So again, does this story put into question the validity of measuring the success of the Chinese model, whether we call it socialist or other, in terms of market economics? And going back to my first question, are we looking at the awakening of a new paradigm where state and private, public sector and private companies will become into a new entity that we have not completely envisioned?
My name is Victor Echegoyen. I'm from Escuela Nacional Preparatoria. And my question is, in terms of the reforms, even though they were not so good implemented, can we see this as the end of this political system? Can this be compared with the Russian perestroika? Is this the end of an era? Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is Pablo Pasapera. I used to be in China for 12 years. I employ a very small company making tortillas. I sell tortillas to the Mexican community and also to the Mexican restaurants. When I established the company in Beijing, I had to drive some money. It's a capital register. This capital register is money that the Mexican company has to give to the Chinese company. It's owned by the Mexicans. This money has changed against the kind of company, the size of the company, and the purpose of the company at that time. At that time, my company was a typical product selling in China. But through the year, it happens in 2005. Through the years, this money has changed. How much is the money that the company itself, no small, big or small, technical or whatever, how is the money that the company overseas has to drive to China in order to register the company? This is the first question. The second question is, until 2014, we used to have several licenses, including the tax license, the industrial and commerce license, statistics license. This three is the main. There are several other licenses as well. In 2014, they changed into one. And last year I received the notice that they have to change into the 5 licenses. I don't know what it means. I have not been there for 1 year. I would like to know. Okay? Thank you.
So there are a lot of great big questions here, starting with Enrique's questions, right? So let me, with your permission, let me jump around a little bit. Has the capitalist paradigm weakened? Absolutely, right? There's no question about it. I mean, not only because of the global financial crisis itself, which occurred because of regulatory failures and macroeconomic failures in the United States. Obviously that harmed not only the productivity of the global economy, but also the reputation of the free market system. Now, I would have argued that after that incredible blunder, United States policy in recovering from the global financial crisis was pretty good, reasonably good, and that as the US economy recovered, that the reputation of the capitalist system and the free market system was poised to also recover. And certainly, unquestionably, we observe within China that the stronger the reputation of the American model of capitalism, the bolder reformers are, or effectively they carry out reforms, and then the more successful they are as an economy. So as somebody who believes that China would be better off with a more aggressive and more thorough program of market-oriented reforms, of course I wish the United States were doing better and providing a more persuasive model. But of course, with the beginning of the Trump presidency, all this is sort of thrown in doubt. Trump administration has adopted many policies. I mean, coming at the end of 8 years of economic recovery, Trump administration pro-cyclical that inject too much stimulation into the economy on the back of a recovery, and so we're all extremely worried about that. So in some sense, maybe we should think of this Chinese model as a source of supply that's responding to a need that people all over the world feel, rather than a model that's actually that well-defined and that coherent in and of itself. I mean, everybody would like to believe that there is a way to combine government and markets in an effective way than the U.S. is. I would say more effectively than Japan or Europe has done, both of which seem to have sacrificed substantial dynamism, secure society. But having said that, can we find in the Chinese, in Xi Jinping's talk about a Chinese model, socialism with Chinese characteristics, can we sit down and have a discussion where we feel that there are clear elements of it and that these are either clearly successful or at least clearly on track to working? And I would say the answer to that has to be no, we don't. To me, I would hope one of the big takeaways of the talk today, and hopefully the whole week, is China changes so rapidly. Many of the things, the policies that we see are really, really recent and haven't had a chance to work through in the economy. So just as the economists, I think, were right in 2002, 2003 to say, all right, there's going to be an acceleration of the economy after a lag because of a productivity impetus. And today we're seeing policies that haven't been in place for 2 or 3. So we don't know what their ultimate impact is. This enormous effort that China is making on technology, talk more about on Friday. I think it's certain that it will waste a lot of money. What's not certain is, will it succeed even though it's wasted all this money? It might, but it might not. There are a lot of issues, and hopefully Friday we'll talk about the semiconductor industry, because much as I respect Dieter Ernst, a great expert on the semiconductor industry, I think I would interpret what's happening in a very different way. So I think that Xi Jinping obviously is a kind of political genius. He must be. He was so ahead of everybody else in seeing the potential for his own personal power. He kept his thirst for power under wraps for 20 years because he understood that was the only way to really correlate the forces in a way that he could pick up the strands of power that he saw lying around and bring them together on personal control. But nobody's perfect. Nobody can do everything. And Xi Jinping, as an economist, sorry, I just don't see it. I don't think this guy thinks about the economy in a way that an economist thinks in terms of goals, national goals, and instruments. So it's easy to see his vision in that sense of socialism with Chinese characteristics is indeed, as somebody said, I think the introduction of government instruments, and maybe even more so policy instruments, as non-market elements, which he then hopes to meld with the market, which he knows very well is efficient and workable, and so he just hopes those things can go together. Not sure. Forever, these are such great questions. I could talk forever about them, but you know, is Xi Jinping perestroika? Is this the end of the system? No. If anything, Xi Jinping represents somebody who says this system was evolving in ways that meant it was going to disintegrate, either through corruption or just through increasingly diverse society that demanded many things. And he said, no, the only way we can prevent this happening is through rivalrous political. Not see under his rule any kind of weakening of the political. Maybe let me end with the wonderful question that Enrique asked. Is the public sector a source of growth, or is it a source of inefficiency and potential crisis going forward? Because that's the big question. That's the $10,000 question. You know, I think in the first couple decades of China's reform, it was easy to answer the question by delaying privatization and not that Jeff Sachs said Bolivia should do and Russia should do and Mongolia should do. It was clearly much better as a policy outcome. Politically, there's some other, some things you could debate, but just in terms of pure economics, it was clear that China was able to use state ownership, or able to use the legacy position of state firms and other state organizations as a positive element in the transition process. I think that's clear. But now we're talking about something very, very different. And I suppose I've got to say my instincts are more aligned with Ann Stevenson. That these are policies that my training as an economist tells me have to have a negative impact. Therefore, have to have a negative impact on the stability of the financial system. Because a big question going forward is how the financial system, which is increasingly being pulled into use in serving these priorities, will respond to the inevitable failures. Because, of course, any innovative process has to be marked by failure as well as success, and the financial system has to be able to. So my instincts are that this is a movement that creates inefficiency. But on the other hand, we also have to see that this is, as we talked about on Monday, this is a policy of enormous real investment in and Chinese capable and flexible, and they learn quickly, and this enormous investment may indeed overcome the inefficiency and friction of institutions that are used to implement.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. So we have time for a second round of questions. 1 moment. You give your name, Sergio.
Very much. Sergio Ley, I am former ambassador of Mexico to China. I have exposition. Thank you very much for your exposition, Professor Naughton. I totally agree with it. I would like to make a comment on the fact that one of the greatest reforms that have been made in China, in my own opinion, is the reform within the Communist Party itself. I think the Communist Party, for the first time in the formation of cadre, they have been able to a balance of political science and business science. The normal cadre, especially the new ones, the young ones, have a tremendous knowledge about business. And I think that this has been quite important for the development of the economy of China itself. And another question that I want to make to you is China has been, even during the years of great poverty for the country, a tremendous high rate of savings. What this rate of savings still continues to be very high nowadays. What role that rate of savings could have been in the development of China itself and the rapid growth that the economy has done? Thank you.
Hi, I'm actually here. So I was looking, when looking at that graph. Hello? Hi. Hi, Professor Naughton. I would like you to comment a bit more on these human capital intensive industries that you mentioned that the Chinese government is still holding on to, in particular research and education. And if I would like to know your opinion as to whether the Chinese government is going to let go or continue driving these sectors, in particular because, I mean, they are strategic for economic growth and innovation.
Thank you very much. My name is Avidan Guerrero, and I'm an international relations student. So I'm very interested in what you said about that the increasing control of the state-owned enterprises by the government, no, by the Communist Party. And I want to ask you if this is related to the role that these enterprises are going to have in the One Belt, One Road initiative. I mean, is this related to that the government is increasing their power, their control on these enterprises, and that these enterprises are going to have a very important role in the building of this strategy, but in a sense of more like geopolitical thinking, what you said about the current president of China, that he thinks more like well, I think that more in a geoeconomic or geostrategic way, no, more than in financial or economic thinking. So, yeah, it will have an impact, this increasing control on the souls in the One Belt, One Road initiative. That's the question. Thank you.
Good questions. Didn't even answer the gentleman who ran the tortilla factory. I apologize for forgetting. That's actually a simplification of the regulatory system is, I think, one of the clear successes of market-oriented reform under, in this case, especially Premier Li Keqiang, who was really personally associated with that. They really tried to make regulatory environment streamlined, and from everything I've heard, it actually worked. So that partial answer I can't answer. And it's really an honor to have three ambassadors here too. Say how honored I am that these three gentlemen have come and asked a lot of difficult questions. And So, some of the things that were asked we will talk about on Friday, because both the high-tech push and the Belt and Road, are really part of this increasing steerage desire. And it's funny too, you even see some people talking about the fact that big data and artificial intelligence planners might actually be able to plan things, because look how efficient Amazon is. Maybe there's a way for planners to do so in a way, I think some of this stuff is under question in a way that we never would have expected. And I think if you can come back on Friday, I think we'll certainly talk more about Belt and Road. The Chinese saving rate is so high, right? It's over 50% of GDP. A decade. So let's assume, that 2 or 3% of this shows up as external surplus. That's probably acceptable to the world. It's maybe not to Donald Trump, but to most people. So then the question is, what rate can China smoothly manage its way down? Household saving, some people were predicting it would start to decline now. Over the long term, household saving should decline. Obviously, the government can reduce its saving rate, because now the government's contributing about 8 to 10 percentage points of GDP in saving. Just reduce that by cutting taxes. Investment program. So, I think the prospect is for a steady decline, but if some financial issues that I haven't really talked about, but that, because people worry about it all over the world, so I assume people are worried about it too. People worry that the Chinese financial system could produce a really sudden shock. And in that case, a fairly high saving rate would still be in place, and it would create pressure for capital outflows. And I think it's something we have to watch carefully and just hope that we can work through the short-run instability factors and hope that there's a gradual process reduction in the saving rate, because Americans save too little. Reforms within the Communist Party, I would say they're all pretty much anti-reforms. They're all going in the wrong direction. There was under Hu Jintao and Li Yuanzhou a movement toward to really try to institutionalize selection processes within the Communist Party. Most of that's still in place. Xi Jinping has basically said, no. Leadership is more important. Commitment to the great cause of the party is more important than just being a member. And as proof of that, you all have to pay your back dues for the dues you haven't paid for the last 10 years. So I think that's taking us also in uncharted directions. And I guess the last thing I should say is I think I forgot to show my last slide, because one of the things my last slide shows is at least Chinese happiness has improved significantly since 2003. And there's no longer a Chinese paradox, as China has continued to become more prosperous in the decade plus since 2000. Chinese self-reported happiness has also gone up. And so one of the things that tells us is, although we see contradictions in Xi Jinping's approach, I certainly see many contradictions in Xi Jinping's approach, so far he's pretty popular. And the contradictions that we see in China are no greater than the contradictions that we see in the United States, for example.
Thank you very much. We will see you Friday, and take a look at the webpage. You will find the afternoon, the power. Thank you very much.